Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Johnson. Welcome to the Datazone on Digital Works TV. And today we're talking to Brian Odom. He is the chief historian for NASA, and he's based at Marshall Space Flight Center. Hey, let's take a quick time out for some great news. Open enrollment is here. Digital Works Academy is offering a series of courses on model-based systems engineering. First up, an introduction to MBSE. This short course is designed for executives, managers, and senior leaders who want to know more about model-based systems engineering. The course explains what MBSE is, why it matters, and how it can improve the scope of projects from cost to schedule to quality. You will be more than ready to support your organization when it inevitably moves to MBSE. Again, enrollment is open right now. To make sure you have a seat, scan the QR code on your screen or go to the link at our website, digitalworks.org. To make sure there's a spot for you, register now. Enrollment is open. Brian, today we're going to talk about the history of Marshall. And is it okay if I say before you became NASA's chief historian?
You got it.
You were Marshall's chief historian.
That's
so
right.
This is certainly something you can talk about. All right, let's start at the beginning. So there's this ceremony at Redstone Arsenal. NASA already exists. It existed since '58, but in 1960, I think I'm correct about the date, there was a ceremony and all these folks walked outside as Army employees. The ceremony goes on. They turn around and walk back in the building, and half of them are now NASA employees of Marshall Space Flight Center. Am I right about that?
That's right.
So let's start there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what went on after half the people became members of Marshall Space Flight Center.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the old Army Ballistic Missile Agency right there at Redstone. They'd done a lot of great work before that. Redstone, they got this long history there, you know, launching America's first satellite, Explorer 1. And really, when the NASA's created in 1958, they know they're going to need propulsion systems to do anything. It's the foundation of the work they're going to do. And they know where the preeminent group is. It's in Huntsville. And, you know, so they know they have to have that. So from 1958 to 60, there's that long negotiation between the Army. The Army doesn't want to give up a capability. There had been you know, all these, you know, the Department of Defense was kind of going at each other with the Navy having a program, the Air Force thinking this should all be theirs, the Army here at Marshall, at Redstone. You know, so they don't want to let this go, but you know, this group is starting to develop the, you know, what would become the Saturn I, right? So this clustering of that Redstone.
Well, let me just one interjection. Am I correct that one reason for NASA and for Marshall was the fact that President Eisenhower believed it should be a civilian space agency? Am I right about that?
That's right. You know, he wants it to be open, above board. It's, you know, it's peaceful. It allows for the exchange of information, and it really it eliminates a problem that is that the Department of Defense, the different agencies that are, you know, the Department, you know, the Army, the Air Force, they're fighting with each other, and so it removes the problem, but it makes it peaceful. Exchange of scientific data, all these great things. And, you know, that group, like I said, they were building the Saturn I, which from the Army's perspective, why do we need that? You know, that began to be the question floated around the Army. This is not something that we need. But there was a group who needed it, and it was NASA.
Well, am I also correct that one of the things, many of the German rocket team, which led the effort for NASA, for Marshall Space Flight Center, they were working for the Army. They were building missiles and stuff, but secretly all these guys wanted to go to space. And so sometimes, just from what I know, it felt like a lot of things were shaded toward that, even when they were working for the Army.
That's right. You know, space was always that science fiction background. You know, everybody had read Jules Verne. Everybody wanted to do something great, right? And so, you know, the Army, even back in Germany, you know, the group had, you know, they built the V2, and so there was this, you know, this militaristic use of the weapon of the technology, you know. But you know, so by the time they get here, you know, you've had a long time kind of digested period here. In the 1950s, the Collier's magazines, the Disney shows that they were involved with, kind of selling the concept that space is real, space is something we can do. So they did that while they were with the Army, right? So, you know, it seems kind of odd that would be the case today. But, you know, it was just that way to sell this capability, you know, this foundational capability that Eisenhower was, hesitant to embrace to some degree, his warnings against the industrial military complex. And if we get in a 1-to-1 race with the Soviet Union, we may have to become like them to beat them, and that might be a problem too. What do you lose in that process? But Kennedy sees it the other way, right? Technology has a transformative power, and to look at we need to go to the moon and do the hard things, but not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And so there is that embrace by the time you get to 1961. So there is a bit of a transition there in thinking philosophically from those two presidents. And, the Germans, and by this point, in 1950, they come to Huntsville in the first place. So a lot of people forget about that. By the time we get to 1960, they'd been here for a decade.
And this was and they had, I believe, become U.S. citizens.
Yeah, 1954, they were citizens by 54. There's this influx of American soldiers, for the Army who are coming to work. They're engineers, they're, in STEM education fields, and they want to work for the Army. They want to do this missile work. That group has become truly infused with those Germans by this point in what we call the arsenal system, right? Yeah. This idea that dirty hands, we're going to do the work ourselves in-house, understand it fully. And that's in 1960 when that group transitions. That's this long digestion process of thinking about space, of working in these systems, and ready to have a capability that NASA needs to deliver Kennedy's mission when it shows up later.
Okay, so he makes a promise, and he makes it a couple times. He makes it to Congress, but the big speech where he said we choose to go to the moon and these other things that you already quoted.
Sure.
He makes that at Rice University.
Mm-hmm.
And so he promises to do something that absolutely needs Marshall Space Flight Center to build a rocket to make it possible. So the president promised and Marshall answered.
Yeah, well, it's not even that, right? When Kennedy's first contemplating the ideas, he comes to Marshall to ask that question. What can we do? How can we beat the Soviets? They've beaten us with a satellite. They've beaten us with a man in space, and they're going to beat us some other way. What can we do? What capability we have? That question is answered at Marshall by the group here, gives Kennedy the confidence in that system so they can jump in at any stage and give assistance. The government can give assistance to the contractor.
Okay, we talked before we even started about doing interviews with people who worked with the Saturn V program, and I had multiple people tell me we could not wait to go to work. And is that what you hear? I have heard these guys who were doing something that had never been done. It was like, not how long do I have to work? Do you need me to come in today?
At any level, you think about, the way in history we look and we think everybody knew everything as it was happening at all at one time, right? But that wasn't the case. People, left Marshall Space Flight Center one day, went home, watched on TV the president give a speech, and they were like, oh my, I'm going to go back to work and I'm going to have to do that, And so what I've talked to a lot of people, and they tell me, just how shocking that was. And they go, can that be done? And then they have to go into work and they have to dig into the problems. They're engineers. That's what they do. Right. But, it's just massive what it's going to take to do that. All of the different pieces that have to be invented from blank sheets, and it's just problems that have to be solved, like, the old combustion instability and all of these kind of things that you don't really understand, but you engineer a solution to it. But, and that's the kind of thing it takes.
I had an engineer, that combustion instability thing. An engineer said, we solved it because we went and looked at a V2 actually. He said, but I'm not sure we ever really understood what it was going on.
100%. They brought in some, and that's the other thing about this. It's government and industry, but it's also academia, right? So they'd bring in people from Princeton and Harvard and say, what is this causing this? It's turbulence at the injector plate, right? What do we do about it? I don't know, try a bunch of different stuff, right? And so they have to build this perfect, what they come up with is a kind of a mitigation system that it worked, and the thing stopped, the F1 engine stopped blowing up.
Yeah.
So I guess we did it.
And what you just said, these days in the modern world, if you test something and it fails, there are hearings about what's going on. guy out at Marshall told me, he said, we blew stuff up all the time. And he said, did you get upset? No, that's how you learn stuff.
That's the idea. What we have now, the computer technology, computation, the ability to model, and is just fundamentally different, right? Because if you're modeling something and your models are so far off that you're having this, now that's a problem. But if you look at back in the 50s and the early 60s, you don't know where failure exists, so you have to find it. Yeah. And when you find it, you then can ask different question sets. You can say, what's causing the failure? Where are the margins? Where do I need a more robust system? Yeah. Where can I get by with less? And it's this iterative process with the explosions, right? That's what an engine's doing, is exploding. So it's just, can we control that and use it for power?
Okay, so they're learning all these things. What was it like at Marshall? I assume from 60 to, say, 65, and that's when they tested the main engines. Am I right? I was here then. So my house shook, my dog hid under the bed, all that kind of stuff. But all during this time, the workforce was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, wasn't it?
Yeah, over 7,000 people, just at civil servants at Marshall Space Flight Center at one time. You're right, up to 60, 65. So you're talking about a full center. Where do we put people? We need more people. We can't get enough engineers. And in fact, in the early 60s, something we talk about, Project Paperclip, that had brought the scientists over, that project continued for into the 1960s, because you just couldn't find enough engineering talent. And the schools just weren't producing the people. So anybody who's coming out of engineering schools in America can write their own check. They can participate in something great, and so you can. It's not hard to find them, but you got to put them somewhere. And you can't just keep building and building and building. You're kind of constrained a little bit. So you're talking shoulder to shoulders in the hallways, elevators crowded. You remember the old 4200, where the Von Braun Hilton there, where, you got the 4 elevators there in the bank, and they're all full, and they're just constantly going, So, you can imagine that creates quite an energy, and a serendipity that's just. These are very smart people in this still today. People at the agency and people in industry are very, very smart who are doing this job. And you put them in that room and you ask them to collaborate and how do decisions get made? How does innovation happen? That's what's happening in the 1960s. And so what's it like at the center in the 1960s? I mean, in 1964, 65, it just has to be one of the most intellectually stimulating places on the planet.
Because they were doing things that had never been done.
Asking questions that had never been asked.
I was told that there used to be, I don't know how often they had them, but a regular meeting where they'd have couldn't have been in Von Braun's office, wasn't that big, but there was a big meeting, and you were not only... They hoped you'd ask a question if you had a concern, but you were required to ask a question, and they would hash it out right then. Is that true?
Yeah, without a question. I mean, it was a very, it's definitely open, because you want that innovation, because you need the answer and you don't know where it's going to come from. So if you create a world that's very stifling to somebody, speaking up, it's going to stifle that innovation, and you're never going to get you never get the problem solved. You never figure out what happened. You'll never, these things. And so, you think about these huge conference tables with the big screens, people got their drawings there being projected, people sitting along the walls, people packed in, sitting in the hallways, somebody hollering out the door, go find so and so, I need an answer to this question.
And they would do that. They would do that, and it wasn't like they weren't going to. They had to have the human being to talk about it.
But if you were a man, and the other thing was true too. There's an obligation. If you're a manager and you don't understand something, that could be a problem for you, because it was a very demanding job. But the idea that you were sitting at the top of this problem, you have to know it inside and out. And that's what a lot of everybody in this, the people in this program who made it successful, they understood, things that on a level that it would concern me if I had to know that much today.
Okay, so they were progressing along with the Saturn V, and they were doing the German rocket team especially liked to do test flights, and they were doing test flights, and doesn't it go all the way up to Apollo 8 where they're still learning things?
Without a doubt. The big decision that was made early on to meet the schedule was all up, right? So that's what we refer to as all up testing on the Saturn V, where the Germans had a more conservative approach, like you said, test to failure, test to understand, test as you fly, all these things. So traditionally they would have launched the dummy upper stages, the first stage live, then second and first stage together, then first and third stage. But all up means we're going to launch all 3 stages of the Saturn V the first time we fly it. And that was in November of 67 with Apollo 4. It shocked them how flawless almost that was. And then Apollo 6, they're like, oh, what could go wrong? Everything, probably. So they had.
But it still made it. It still made it.
It made it to orbit, but not like they had hoped. It had, problems in every phase. Pogo up and down from the first stage.
That's
J2
the fuel
engines.
fuel in the tubes.
Thrust oscillation. I mean, if you had astronauts at the top, would they have survived? We wouldn't want to find out the answer that way. And so after Apollo 6 that had all these problems, it's like, we still have to hurry because maybe the Russians will fly a crew on the Zond mission around the moon. Well, let's just put 3 guys on the next one. And that's that's bold challenges. It's taking risks, but it's risks that you understand because your engineering was sound. You knew what the problems were. You had mitigating. You could, pogo accumulators for pogo. You understood that what happened on the actuator for the J2, you fixed it so you could mitigate it. And so at some point you just have to go, right? And so that's Apollo 8, and the miracle of Apollo 8 is, this horrible year in American history, 1968, world history, really. In December at the end of that, you have that American crew going around the moon, showing humanity something it had never seen, and Earth just hanging out in the balance, rising over the lunar horizon there. And so that gives hope to the world, but it also means that Kennedy's dream might come true, right? Because we're going to go back to low Earth orbit with Apollo 9. Apollo 10 does everything but land humans on the moon, and then you're successful just in the nick of time in the summer of 69.
Okay, so that's 69. And one thing that everybody who knows about Marshall Space Flight Center should know is by then they had developed the rocket and people were being laid off. There were reduction in force.
You got it. That's a term, that reduction in force, that in a development, what I call the travails of a development center, right?
And that's what Marshall
is, right? So it's going to develop the system, and once it develops, we get it online. We're starting to see missions. We're starting to see hardware. You no longer need that huge marching army. So in 65, you begin the process of laying people off. And so you won't have Apollo 11 till another 4 years. And so for 4 years, Marshall Space Flight Center is faced with a problem. It's delivered a massive capability to make this possible, but it also has to figure out, what do we do now? And the what do we do now question for a development center is critical. Are we going to develop another Saturn V? No, that's not going to happen, right? Are we going to, industry's got that now. What do we turn to? And a lot of people, Bill Lucas, who was the center director, he led something called program development. And it's basically, NASA liked to pit centers against each other, compete for business because competition drives innovation. Within an agency, you want people to compete against each other. And it's an odd concept really back then. But, we believe that NASA believed that would make it better. So what did the agency do? Well, they turned to science. And, what NASA's Marshall is known for today is not just propulsion. Clearly, that's fundamental to its DNA. But science is another huge piece of what they do. And that's from that decision. What do we do now? High energy astronomy would lead to what we have with Chandra X-ray Observatory, the Imaging X-ray Polarimetry Explorer. Today, that world is kind of comes out of that. But also Hubble, the engineering work that was done for Hubble here is, a critical part of that. So, the development center had to solve its problem of finding work for its employees.
And the first space station.
The first space station.
They came out of us using a Saturn V.
Saturn V hardware. So we've got this hardware. What do we do with the capability that we've created? And that's where that Skylab question comes in. And Skylab is a laboratory in space, America's first, and it's the third stage of a Saturn V, outfitted for human space flight in low Earth orbit. Well, there were some problems with that too, but that also demonstrates another thing that Marshall has, right? And it's shown throughout its history, adaptability and solving problems in risky environments. When Skylab launched as part of this, it was an uncrewed mission there when it first launched. But when it launched, it had a problem. The micrometeoroid shield ripped off, and it was just a nightmare. The solar arrays were stuck. So you were going to have to send human beings in a low Earth orbit to rescue that. Those operations, those tools, that hardware to do that was learned right there in the neutral buoyancy simulator at Marshall. Get people up there, let them solve the problem, teach them how to work with the tools that they have. And let's solve this problem. Let's get this laboratory going and make it not an oven in low Earth orbit, which is a problem, right? We got to cool this thing down. And they did. And then, Skylab became hugely successful. It teaches us how to live and work in low Earth orbit, solve incredibly challenging problems. But it also had solar physics, where we're looking at the sun, learning incredible things. So Marshall also today, heliophysics. That DNA goes back to Skylab. Also, Earth Resources Applications Package, where we're looking back at Earth, learning not only using low Earth orbit, using space as a platform to solve earthly problems. Again, something else that Marshall is known for. And all of that, like you said, go back to your question. All of that kind of flows from this development center problem of what do we do now? What do we do with what we have? What do we do with the skill set that's here in place? And that center, and that's what Marshall has been doing for a long time, because as you know, the next thing that was going to come along propulsion-wise was the Space Shuttle, and that's the truck for low Earth orbit, right? That's going to be the thing. I was going to
say, so when did the actual we need a reusable spacecraft. Let's start developing that. When did they start thinking that?
From way back. Remember that we were talking about the Disney and the Collier's magazines, and that had always been part of the program. The paradigm originally was go to low Earth, lift off from Earth, go to low Earth orbit, build a station, learn to live and work, then go from there to other destinations, the moon, Mars, wherever. Kennedy kind of circumvented that, right? He said, what if we just went straight to the moon? Well, we could do that. We wouldn't have planned to do it that way, but that's the way we'll do it. And so that's kind of what happens here. They go back in and they say, okay, we're going to, and by the time you get through Apollo, that development center, you say, okay, what's next? Well, that's a budget question, right? What can we afford post-Apollo? And things are changing by the late 60s. You have, again, we mentioned it, the Vietnam War, social crisis, a lot of energy crisis that will come a little bit later. All of these different pieces are challenging the budget. So what can we do? Well, the person who's going to answer that in 1968 is going to be Richard Nixon, right? Nixon is not Johnson. He's not Kennedy. He's kind of economic, fiscal conservative. I guess we'll call him that. So he says, what can we do? Well, here's what we'd like to do. Tom Paine, the NASA administrator at the time, says we want to go to Mars and we want to do everything possible. And he says, I need you to slow down, right? I need you to hold on. He says, what is the first thing you want that you can have? The baseline here, and that's where the shuttle comes in. At first, Nixon's not really a big proponent of any of this stuff. He says, well, what if we just didn't do anything? And it's Caspar Weinberger who sends him a memo and says, if you don't do something, the world will look at us and say, America's best days are behind it. And Nixon says, okay, then I'll give you the shuttle.
Okay. Now, the Space Shuttle, without going into great detail, there was kind of an initial design, and then there was a design that made possible military use. And that changed the design of the shuttle to what we ended up with. Is that
you got it?
Is that correct?
It's correct. If we're gonna have low Earth orbit be one truck to low Earth orbit, it's gonna be asked to do a lot of different things. NASA would never have designed the Space Shuttle to look just like it did if it weren't constrained by other ways. I mean, it's an excellent system, but the way what it has to deliver is quite a challenge, and it is constrained there. And ultimately, that part of the paradigm fails, and eventually that the DoD is not happy with the delivery rate. At first they thought the shuttle was going to launch 80 times a year.
Yeah.
And then they're like, "This is okay. That's not going to happen."
Yeah.
And so now the DoD is kind of stuck. They're like, "Okay, well, now what do we do?" Well, we need expendable launch vehicles. We need that hybrid approach, and that's.
But that design to make the military happy is what brought the huge external tank covered with foam. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
Yeah, that's true.
And the foam, the space shuttle, I mean, it flew 135 times. Is that
That's right.
135 times, and 2 of them were disasters. And so you can look at it statistically speaking. It was a kind of always 1 in 100 chances something would go wrong, but the foam was always a problem. Am I right about that? But despite that, the space shuttle was the most successful, most complex machine in human history, but its very design was a problem.
Its design was problematic, and there were, it was always, one of the things about it is, very early on, it was declared to, the test flights were behind it. It was now operational. As a historian, I look at the space shuttle program and I'd say, this shuttle was a magnificent thing. They're complicated. Those engines are phenomenal. It had a lot of constraints that built it that it had to make a lot of compromises in design, but it was always evolving. The shuttle was always evolving, and I would consider it to be kind of an X vehicle, right? It's delivering an incredible mission, building the International Space Station, launching Hubble, Chandra, all these incredible things, just doing great work for DoD, for all of the things that we need there. But those engines, when they looked at the risk chart of this thing and they knew how complex it was, the space shuttle made engines. They said, "Oh boy, those things are a challenge." And so funding follows risk in a situation like that. And so you concentrate so heavily. You have, spectrometers on the exhaust plume trying to see what is it eating, because it's, the engines were eating themselves from time to time. Those turbines, it's so powerful.
Well, yeah, I mean,
the turbo pumps, and they changed the turbo pumps at one point. They moved to these Pratt and Whitney pumps. Rocketdyne didn't like that at all. So it's all these decisions that are being made. But you then accept risk in other places because of that, right? You say, let's focus on the thing that's going to get us, and it's probably the space shuttle main engines. Yeah. And so you don't turn your, so you think about Challenger with the solid rocket boosters, right? And so that design, the O-ring problem that ultimately is what causes Challenger, they understood that risk. They understood they were having a problem. It's what, Diane Vaughan calls the normalization of deviance, right? You're not supposed to get any erosion in that joint. We're seeing erosion in that joint, but it still works. Okay, well, let's just recharacterize the risks, but we're going to continue to fly.
Is it? And of course, Marshall's workforce is back up during the space shuttle program and the development. And you mentioned it, but the space shuttle made the space station possible. The space shuttle took Chandra and Hubble and installed them in space. So I mean, the space shuttle is doing great things, not just for NASA, but for America.
Oh, sure.
And for the world. And once again, Marshall Space Flight Center is making all this stuff happen. I don't think people get that the Hubble Space Telescope, which until the new one,
James Webb,
James Webb Telescope, but Marshall was in charge of the Hubble up until it was in space. Correct?
Right. It was the engineering behind that is definitely Lockheed Martin. Lockheed at the time working with Marshall. On this project for a long time, and then Goddard gets involved in the science and institute and the operations and that sort of thing. But so it is. There are all these challenging moments. It's always I hate to go there, but it's kind of this yin and yang of success and failure living together so closely. That's what the shuttle was. These failures that we have. Hubble, obviously known for the aberration of the primary mirror,
but the space shuttle made fixing it possible.
But the space shuttle made fixing it possible. The engineering made its ability to be fixed possible. These are the things that we forget, right? Everybody's like, oh, look at the failure of Hubble on orbit with a blurry primary mirror. It's like, you know we can fix that, right?
And
we can do it in space. You know human beings are going to launch to space in a shuttle, get out of the shuttle, go and service a satellite, service an observatory. It's amazing that you can do that. I mean, I think that's what people really don't understand, is how complicated that is.
Oh yeah, and there are a couple things here. One is if you look back at NASA's history, like the Apollo 13, was a failure that many people consider one of the great moments in spaceflight, where there were really bad problems and they were solved.
Sure.
Well, throughout the shuttle program, there were really bad problems, both with the shuttle and with the Hubble Space Telescope, but people at Marshall Space Flight Center were part of figuring it out.
Yeah, the engineering, phenomenal. It's just the idea that you can do any of this is incredible. But if you look at where we started with the Wright brothers in the early part of the 20th century, and then to be landing on the moon in '69, and then to build an International Space Station and start that process before the century's out, that's an incredible leap. And it's human, it's ingenuity, it's government investment, right? Research and development, but it's people have to pick that baton up and go make that happen, and that's what Marshall is known for, really, embracing the challenge, being willing to test, and being willing to accept, accept that risk, that this is a risky business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a former Marshall engineer who said it's a bomb with the end cut off.
Sure, without a doubt.
It's like, okay, so Marshall Space Flight Center, a decision is made that we need something more. We want to do other things besides just have a glorified pickup truck to get to the space station. We want to have a new spacecraft, but NASA and Marshall ran into the problem that there's not enough money to keep flying the shuttle and to develop a new rocket. So Marshall is back to the development center thing. And let's talk about that. When they made that decision, was there like, oh man, I can't, this is going to be hard. How quickly can we do this to get to the space launch system?
One of the most innovative periods in Marshall's history was moving on from the space shuttle. And that's, again, another thing that's kind of a hidden.
If there'd been enough money, they would not have done that.
Well, I think it's Columbia that really does change the paradigm there. After Columbia, it's not necessarily about money. It's like we've got to move on from the shuttle. And what you mentioned there is what we call a funding wedge, right? You only got so much funding, and to have something to move forward to new things, you've got to let go of old funding, or there has to be a new funding wedge to come in. Or how do we carve that out? So that's a procurement question, right? But the idea of what comes next, so if we know in late 1960s, early 1990s, early 2000s, one program that's really awesome, and Gary Lyles, you might talk to Gary about it, but it's the Space Launch Initiative, where Marshall is challenged, go and innovate, do something, reusability, low cost, subcontractors, who haven't been in the game before. Let's grow an industry. Marshall is challenged with all of those at the same time, and be innovative. One of the things that kind of led to that in 1999 was the X-34. And the engine for that was the fast track engine, the MC1 engine. And it was just a challenge of a clean sheet engine.
Now, the X-34 is a smaller, am I correct? It looks a little bit like the Space Shuttle.
You got it.
It's just
smaller.
smaller.
Yeah,
it was it's intended for military use. Am I right about that?
It's an X-37, I think.
All right.
But there was a lot of questions about that. But so this new engine that we develop here, the fast track engine, a lot of those innovative designs, a lot of those new manufacturing techniques that kind of came from that is this burst of creativity. And in fact, it's the fast track and that creativity which leads to a lot of the work that SpaceX is doing right now with the Merlin engine. There is a DNA from that work to the Merlin engine that makes SpaceX successful.
Quick interjection here
Sure.
is like SpaceX has done phenomenal things, but the groundwork for nearly everything SpaceX does was laid by NASA and particularly by Marshall Space Flight Center, in propulsion especially, or development?
You got it. In the early period there, right, especially with that engine. And so Marshall, and with that Space Launch Initiative, especially when you get to 2003 with the Columbia disaster and George W. Bush with the vision for space exploration, which was a new moon to Mars, you're going to need all these new systems. And that period, though, from the late 1990s to about 2003, 2004, was incredibly important here.
Yeah.
These having that capability of engineers on the ground, and that's a problem with a budget constrained environment, right? It's how do you keep talent? How do you keep people where when you come to them with a challenge, you've got the right people in the right places. They know what they're doing. They have some experience. They understand the system. They can accomplish an objective. How do you do that? Well, it's been done before, right? You look at Apollo, look at the Redstone rocket, all of these systems, right? But by the time you get to the vision for space exploration, Marshall is having to embrace a new challenge that was the Constellation program, and for Marshall it was Ares, right?
Yeah.
So Ares was something that a lot of people, again, people see it as like, well, Constellation was canceled, obviously a miserable failure. No, there's a lot that's learned there, right?
The Ares, there was a test flight. It flew.
Yeah. Ares 1X, right, in 2009. And what you actually have there is you have a situation where people are thinking about new systems. They're designing new systems. They're testing them. They're going through cutting the teeth of failure. They're cutting the teeth of really figuring out what it is to do this work for real. You can do it in a textbook all day long. You can talk about it in school all you want to. But when you get in the lab and you get in there and you have to do the work, and it's risk, and you have to understand, oh, I get it now. That's what that program was all about. And Constellation was a good design. And what Constellation was, it was the idea that you have low Earth orbit and deep space, and you've got to do both, right? Yeah. You've got to keep going to the International Space Station, but we're going to go to the Moon and Mars. So you have the Ares 1 low Earth orbit, Ares 5 that was going to be the deep space,
a larger version.
Yeah. And so the government was going to do both, right? The government was going to do both. And so what commercialization does, and one of the probably the most modern changes to the type of work that Marshall does, is that process that comes along there, where with the cancellation of Constellation and the birth of the Space Launch System, and where we are today with Artemis, you have in 2010. The Senate comes together and they say, this is where Bill Nelson and, some folks from Texas and all kinds of places, what they came together and they said, look, in that authorization, they said, this is where commercial will be, low Earth orbit. Operations, resupply to the International Space Station. Commercial can do that. The government will move on and do things in deep space. Go do that. Who do they come back to? Marshall Space Flight Center, right? And that's where Space Launch System, that technically, the DNA of Space Launch System is back with the Ares 5. The people who, at a lake house one day said, what is the Space Launch System going to be? Well, they had, they'd cut their chops all in all of these programs we've talked about, right? Yeah. Space Shuttle, Constellation, Ares, all of this. And that's why they were ready to do that. But it's, things have changed a lot. But the way the work is done, from an individual level, you can see these things. You see, there are parallels here across this history.
Well, from the development of the Saturn V and the development of SLS, differences, of course, because the technology had changed some, but still the development, with an even tighter dollar, it's right. Pretty impressive, I think.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the myths about Apollo that people do forget. They see that Apollo is like, oh, well, of course, if you've got unlimited money, you can do anything.
They never thought they had unlimited money.
They never had unlimited money. Yeah. There is no such thing as unlimited money. No. And by the time you get to 1967, 68, 69, James Webb, one of the reasons that he leaves the agency is because he gets to go to Congress just like every other administrator and say, don't cut anything. I need the funding. You're asking me to do A. I need the funding to accomplish it. I can't accomplish without the resources.
Yeah.
It's the idea of grand strategy, right? And that's probably what, I've thought about a lot over Marshall's history, is having a grand strategy that doesn't change is impossible in a world that people live in, where political decisions, where changing politics, from one administration to another, changing direction. We're going to have constellation or vision for space exploration, moon to Mars. We're going to go to an asteroid. We're going to go back to moon and Mars. What are we doing today? These things have ramifications at a center. And centers have to, how do we keep people engaged? How do we keep them up to date? How do we continue to have the expertise that we need? Well, this has always been the case. None of this is new.
And okay, so Marshall's still a development center, but it has plenty of science going on. And I'm not going to, there are a lot of questions being asked, and not as many answers maybe as there are questions. But as a historian, as a guy who's seen the arc of Marshall Space Flight Center from the beginning to what it is now, as a historian, do you feel like Marshall's going to be making more history? We just don't know exactly what it is right now. Is that how you'd answer it?
I think it is. I think, there are some things that fundamentally have changed. I think that the role of commercial space right now, when we say commercial space, sometimes some people use that term wrong. Government still invests in research and development. Who they invest that with, it varies. The idea that a commercial firm owns hardware that it uses to do something for you as a customer, that's fundamentally different. I guess the question, really the question becomes, what does the future hold for deep space exploration when it comes to human space flight, big systems? I think that's where we're at an inflection point right now. Is that question will be answered with experience. And we can't answer it with guessing. It has to be answered with experience.
And right now, there's a project to develop nuclear propulsion for deep space and getting to Mars as quickly as we can.
Yes, one of the threads that we could pull back to the very beginning is nuclear, propulsion. Nuclear propulsion is not new. Nuclear thermal propulsion was since the splitting the atom. Boy, wouldn't it be good if we harnessed that to launch. The NERVA program was a huge one back then. But the question became early on. The question became, what are we going to do with this? We're not necessarily going to Mars right now. That we're not going to go to the moon with nuclear propulsion. But what do we need? But Marshall is heavily engaged in that as a propulsion center. It understands that. And from time to time, Marshall has been involved with the DoD, with Department of Energy to say, what are we going to use this for? There have been programs to send uncrewed deep space probes. In the past, Prometheus, all these other things. But over the past even 10 to 15 years, there have been really good investments made in nuclear thermal propulsion, nuclear electric propulsion. That's a more
So they're you just made me think of a question, and I've got to figure out a way to ask this without you feeling like he's trying to get me to say policy. But one of the things, and many people at NASA have said this before, that every 4 years or every 8 years anyway, you get a new president. And new presidents almost always want to change NASA in some way. As a historian, looking back, I'm not just now, but looking back, that's been inefficient sometimes. Am I correct? Let's just put it that way.
I think that maybe another way to say that is all administrations want to put their stamp on space exploration, because it is such an aspirational activity. It's who do we want to be in the future, and how can I and my administration put my stamp on this to achieve some goal that resonates with people. But I will say that NASA has always been a bipartisan agency. And I don't mean that like everybody in Congress loves NASA. I mean, there have been people on either side who loved NASA and who did not like NASA. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a good reason for that too. Yeah. But I think it's always had this support. It's always had this. But it's what, when we deliver, and when the agency delivers on Apollo and it delivers on Kennedy's goal, who's president when that happens? It's Richard Nixon, right? And so Nixon is at a point where, for Nixon, who has a history with the Kennedys, and this is Kennedy's program. This is Johnson's baby. I was vice president when all this stuff started, so he's not ignorant to the space program. He wants to accomplish things with the space program. What's he willing to do? Well, he has to bear that against other responsibilities. And so he sets, each administration sets their national needs, like Kennedy did. Urgent national needs. What do we need to do? And what do we have the resources to do? What is my grand strategy? And a lot of the times I think it's not necessarily that a president derails something from the agency. I think it's a lot of there are these hard decisions that need to be made where, NASA suffers from there are more urgent needs.
And it's not derail, but the administration would probably say not derail, redirect.
Redirected, yeah. We're going to do a little redirect here.
It's okay, but as a historian, it's your job to
Sure.
It's your job to record these things and see how they resonate with all the other things that have been done. So, last question: as a historian, looking at what's gone on and the different times on the workforce has gotten smaller, gotten larger. The development continues, the science continues. You feel good about Marshall Space Flight Center's future?
I do. I think I feel good about the agency, right? Because again, like I said, it's aspirational. It does great things, and this thing in the activity of the agency does produce incredible spinoffs. Yeah. With encouraging people to go into hard fields, to the STEM education, all of these things that NASA really does, right? Because it's so visible. Yeah. But I think the agency in the 1970s is probably you always look for these historical analogies, right? Where are we now? Well, in the 1970s, we were faced with, the agency was faced with, a lot of competing paradigms here. The economy was not great, energy, the whole story, war, government spiraling after Watergate, all of these different things. What is the agency going to do? Well, if we remember also, the 1970s were the golden age of planetary science, right? So deep space, Voyagers, Vikings, all of these things just changing the way we understand the world. At the same time, there are these long developments going on. What will become Hubble is in place there. What will become Chandra is growing from that. All of this earth science, Landsat programs, helping farmers to produce, huge impact on, just how, the food that we grow. All of these things that the agency does that's so critical. You have to avoid, when it comes to NASA, I love human space flight like anybody else does. But what you have to avoid as a spectator or an admirer or someone to NASA is you have to avoid tunnel vision. Sometimes we focus from the outside in, we focus on one thing, and its success is supposed to be exemplified for all of the work that the agency does. That's not what NASA is. Look at everything this agency has done since 1958. If you told people in 1958 what the agency they were creating was going to do, there's no way they would have believed it. There's no way they would have believed it. And so when you think about now where they were in 1958 when they set this thing up, where we are today, whatever the budget is, and the budget will change, the budget will be responsive to national needs, and the politics will play out, national needs will be what they will be, and the agency will continue on, and it will continue to be that visionary thing. And I really do believe that, and I don't just believe that because I'm Pollyannish about the whole thing. As a chief historian, I've seen it before, right? I've read a lot about it. This is the way the agency works, and I can't see to live in a place like America where you don't have an agency like NASA would be a very troubling thing.
All right. Brian Odom, thank you. And by the way, all that goes double for Marshall Space Flight Center, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Thank you, Brian Odom, and thank you for being with us on Digital Works TV, the Datazone, talking about the history of Marshall Space Flight Center and a little philosophy about NASA. And remember, thanks for being with us, by the way, it works.